guys can be seated. Now, what we're going to do first, I'm going to introduce him. Paul, I have the privilege to do so. And I'm actually going to go to the back, and you guys will not see me up here. You guys can just pay attention on the screen. Yeah, hallelujah, right? So I'll sit back there. And the way this is going to work is going to be discussion. For the last few weeks, many of you have had questions or concerns or things that you guys wanted Dr. McAllister to answer and to discuss. And so I'm going to ask questions to him on your behalf. The questions that have been submitted, they may have been edited for clarity or for some of them were very long, and I shortened it and got to the point. So if I ask your question but it sounds a little bit different, my bad. But anyway, that's what we're going to do. So before I go to the back and you don't have to look at me anymore, I want to introduce him. He's been a mentor and really moved into a friendship. He was one of the coaches for my ordination process, the way Church of God is doing it. It's kind of like going to online college. He was one of my essentially professors for one of my classes last year. But we've been in touch. He speaks with wisdom and compassion, and I'm going to maybe poke a little bit of fun with him. I hope he's not offended. I can't hear him if he is. So, but he was, the whole point of the coach is to kind of, we do all of our assignments ahead of time, and you're supposed to, the coach's job is just to allow the students to discuss amongst each other and make sure we get our work and to discuss some things we talked about. And so frequently Paul would be like, okay guys, I'm not going to preach tonight, and then he would. Or he would say something like, okay, we're going to stick to your assignment. I'm not going to talk long. I'm not going to talk long. And then he would, because he's just one of those guys. But every word he says is filled with compassion and wisdom. And I'm excited to share him with you guys today. Some of his credentials, just because he's not just some guy that Pastor Jeff knows, this is some of the things he's doing or has done. So he is the president of Global Leaders in Unity and Evolvement, which is a faith-based public policy think tank. People come together and from the Christian background and decide how best to affect public policy. He's also a senior fellow of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's kind of a big deal in Christian circles. He's the chairman of the Racial Equity Task Force of the North Carolina Council of Churches. And so that's a big fancy way to say this. He represents 18 denominations, 6,200 congregations, and 1.5 million North Carolinians in public policy conversations. So he knows what he practices, what he preaches. He knows what he's talking about. He is the past chair for the Church of God Ministries Racial Unity Commission. He served on that from 2016 to 2018. So he comes from Church of God background, third generation. He knows our movement, he knows our values, and he knows that we can affect change in this world. And if that weren't enough, he's a published author. He previously published a paper called In Pursuit of Racial Unity and Truth, and his book is on its way. Yeah, thank you. If you're watching in the building, make sure you mute yourself. Or else I'm just going to hear me all the time. I don't need to hear me. You do. Amen. So please welcome to the screen, Reverend Dr. Paul McAllister.
Good morning, and I hope that I can be heard well by those of you who are in the sanctuary, as well as those of you who are listening from your various independent settings outside of the sanctuary. I'm very happy to be able to share with you, and I'm testing the system because I think there may be a little echo. And so I'll be looking at the screen from time to time, Pastor Jeff, to make sure that everything is clear and audible. I want to say a word about your pastor. Obviously, you know extraordinarily well. He is certainly a scholar. He is a deep thinker. And I was told to turn off my microphone. Do I have an echo or problem there?
Not anymore. You're good now.
I'm good now? Okay. All right. I apologize for the problem on my part. Perhaps I will start over. Thank you for allowing me to be in your presence this morning. I appreciate you, your pastor, and the opportunity to share with you and answer some of your questions. If there is anything that we do not cover today that you would like to have more information about, then please let me know. And I'll be happy to correspond with your pastor and correspond with you independently if that would happen to be your choice. Your pastor is a scholar. He's a deep thinker. He prepares well. He turns in his assignments on time. And he represents what the best of the Church of God tradition is all about. So I'm happy to be with you this morning, and I look forward to answering your questions.
And I think it's important for us to first really mention why we're taking the time to do this today instead of, we could be talking about heaven, or we could be doing a book study, or we could be, reading some scripture passages, which we obviously will get to scriptures today. But why is it that we decided to do this today instead of the million other things we could possibly be doing in a church service? Would you care to speak to that for us?
Well, I think it's very important, particularly in the season that we seem to be in, with so many issues at hand that we've been dealing with. And these are not new problems that we're confronting. And it's very important for the church to understand that its voice in times like these, and I might even say in trying times like these, needs to be elevated and amplified in a way that allows us to not only have conversations, but also begin to propose solutions, and to do so proactively, rather than waiting and being in a kind of reactive posture, waiting for something negative to explode before we begin to proliferate and announce the good news of the gospel in a way that speaks directly to the challenges of racism in the world. And I might even say why it's important for us to have this conversation, because it impacts our worship. We cannot worship by looking solely at God and never taking into account the world that God has made and the communion that we are blessed to be able to enjoy with one another. So as we worship God, we also honor our human creativity and the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God. So it's part of our worship, responsibility and obligation to God, and also in service to humanity at large.
Everybody taking notes? All right, that's good. So we're going to move into some of the questions now. So these are some questions that you guys sent in to me that I have forwarded to him. Again, some of them may have been edited for clarity, but know that the heart of your questions was meant to be heard. And so we wanted to start with some definitions. As you guys here know, I love my definitions. You guys are laughing about that. But it's important, I think, especially in such a topic as this, to understand what we're talking about. What we hear, the media throws around lots of words and phrases and lots of things, and it's important for us to understand what those mean, or at least what they're supposed to mean, so we can speak properly when it comes to these things. So the first question that I received was, and it's a definition question. I hear the term systemic racism used a lot lately. What is that?
Okay. Most of us are familiar with the term system. A system is something that has various components that are not just brought together sporadically, but that are brought together for some purpose, constructed and designed to fit and mesh and operate well in order to produce a certain impact or a certain outcome. And so when we use the term system in relation to racism, we're talking about something that has been constructed, designed with intent and with purpose. So when you hear the term systemic racism, racism itself is not just what some people think of when they talk about prejudice, meaning to prejudge or evaluate something without having all of the relevant facts and figures and data to give an accurate assessment of that thing. Systemic racism embraces not only racism, but racism that embraces power and privilege because of race. So when we talk about systemic racism and how it works, we're talking about racism that has intent, racism that has history, racism that is tied to legacy, racism that is associated with a well-oiled operation that is difficult to dismantle unless one knows what those constituent elements are. And so systemic racism also veils those elements in such a way that it is able to sustain its operation in the favor or interest of others to the disadvantage of those who are not a part of that initial group that is privileged based on race. And so one of the challenges that we've had, my friends, is that there are some who do not believe that systemic racism is a problem. But all we really need to do is evaluate where we are in history today and compare that to where we have been in history and listen to the voices of the disenfranchised and the most impacted negatively. And I think that gives us a sense of understanding, if we'll listen, to understand what systemic racism, how it works, how it operates, how it plays out in day-to-day experiences that do injury to lives. And when we look at those lives and align them, we can see a situation where there are commonalities, and we have to begin to do some tracing to understand what is the source of these commonalities without necessarily labeling individuals in a prejudicial manner. And all of this is linked, of course, to the element of race itself.
So another question that kind of ties into that, it's almost the opposite of the systemic racism would be the question, what is white privilege? Because that is a common thing that we have heard. People have asked that question. People get offended when they hear that thrown around, especially in Appalachia where we live. You look around and many people in this room, or we know people in this room, you look at their lives and it's very hard to see privilege. You know, they had a rough upbringing. They had many disadvantages. You say white privilege and they are offended because they look at their life and say, I have had no privilege. I don't understand what you're talking about. And yet there is this reality of this thing called white privilege. So what exactly is that? What does that mean?
You know, that's a very astounding reality. And sometimes I don't think we give enough thought and focus to the fact that there are those who may be white who do not feel that they have been systemically advantaged because of their white skin. And so when we think about white privilege, we have to look beyond, I believe, each and every individual and begin to look at a broad canopy that allows us to really think holistically and not just on the individual level. We can certainly understand that there are those who are Black who have experienced privilege. Are there those who are born or raised or part of a certain family that have privilege? And some of that privilege might seem to override or negate the argument about white privilege. But white privilege is something that has been talked about by many scholars down through the years. And what it really refers to is inherent advantages possessed by a white person or those who are in the category of white on the basis of their race in society that allows them to experience more advantages and that create disadvantages and marginalize those who do not have such benefits. And so everyone may not feel that they have had an easy life, and that is true. But broadly speaking, white privilege, and let me give some examples because I think that might be very helpful to us. In fact, I was looking at an article just recently, and I'm going to try to mention several of these articles that I've been referring to as I do more writing and speaking that might help us to further understand. White privilege is when, and I'll give an example of when I was in 8th grade in Darlington, South Carolina. I was attending Brunson Dargan Middle School on the side of town where my parents had moved, and we moved from the quote unquote African American side of town to the white side of town. And the school was across the street from our apartment. I had not had the benefit of attending the school for 6th and 7th grade, and certainly not the elementary school in that area. So I was a relatively unknown individual, but I was a very, very good student, and people recognized that, Jeff. And I remember doing a science project with a friend of mine named Mike. Mike and I not only shared classes together, but we also had library duty together during one of our classes. So we decided when there was an assignment given to do a project, and it had to do with tornadoes or hurricanes or whatever it was. And so we took the project home, we both talked about it, and we worked on it together. But when it was time to do the presentation, Mike could not be there. So I was able to do the presentation in his absence and did so well enough to get an A. And everyone applauded and everyone was impressed. But one day I happened to be looking at my teacher's grade book. She happened to be sitting beside me, and this was several days later. And I was able to glance over and see in her grade book that she had changed my grade from an A to a B. And it was the most astounding thing. And the only thing that I could deduce is that Mike, when he came back, must have said something, whatever that something was, that allowed my grade to be degraded or downgraded to a B. And of course, his grade was still an A. And I looked at my teacher's face in that moment. I'll never forget it. And I could see the guilt that was on her face, because I never would have known that she changed my grade. She never confronted me about anything that was done wrong. She never challenged our source material. The only thing that could have warranted a change of the grade in someone's eyes was the fact that I did the presentation and Mike was absent. And when he returned, he must have said something, or something must have been said to him. I should have been part of that discussion if there was going to be a change of grade. Now that might seem to be a simple matter, but if you graduate or think about that at a macro level, Black people feel that their grade has been changed without their input, without them having done anything wrong, without them having had the benefit of being able to justify or explain or rationalize or answer any questions that were raised. That's what we mean by privilege. Privilege is when you're put into a lesser category so that others can be affirmed, while those who are not in the special category are non-affirmed. And when we think about this affirmation, it might seem to be a little thing or small or insignificant thing until you begin to look at it from the standpoint of, well, who graduates first? What are the class rankings? That B could mean the difference between a number 1 ranking and a number 5 ranking, particularly when you're in a very competitive environment and you're surrounded by many good students, black and white. So privilege allowed my grade to be diminished unfairly, and it allowed Mike's grade to be sustained as an A, and it suggested that he deserves better treatment because he's white. And those who are not white do not deserve just and fair and equitable treatment simply because they are not white. This is what we mean by white privilege. White privilege is being able to go to the bank with little or no documentation and be able to get a significant loan to start a business, when a person who is not white may not have the same connections in society to be able to do that. Or white privilege is when you want to try out for a debate team and you're not given all of the questions because you happen not to go to the same church that others go to, where they can receive the benefit of privilege from the debate school teacher or advisor who is sharing information with those who attend that church who happen to be white, but those who are black who would deserve to know that same information don't get it because they just happen not to be in the right place at the right time. These are examples, as best I can think of, that give us some sense of what white privilege is and what it looks like. And let me say something else about white privilege, because Dr. Massey, I'm going to hold up a book. Many of you are familiar with Dr. James Earl Massey. He is now deceased, Dean Emeritus, of course, of Anderson University. And this is a book entitled Views from the Mountain. It is a compilation of the writings of Dr. Massey, some of his writings, not all of them, by Barry Collin and Curtis Paul DeYoung. They were able to show him the manuscript of this book prior to his transition. And he talks about privilege. He doesn't talk about white privilege, but listen to what he says. James chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, a passage that we are very familiar with. A man with gold rings comes into your assembly, and a man in shabby clothing also comes in, and you pay attention to the one who wears fine clothing and say, "Have a seat here, please," while you say to the poor man, "Stand there," or "Sit at my feet." Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So when we think about white privilege, it is the fact that distinctions are made within society. Whether an individual chooses to make those distinctions is beside the point, because we live in a racialized context, socially, historically, culturally. There are certain benefits that have accrued and continue to be granted to those who are white as opposed to those who are non-white. That's the history of America. And so white privilege is being able to walk down the street or drive down the road in a nice car. I'll give you another example. This is a very important point. White privilege is when you're driving down the road and you're leaving work and you're going to pick up your children from school, and something happens on the highway and there's an accident. A white person driving a Mercedes-Benz might be shown tenderness and kindness by those who stop, and even the police, and not be asked any questions about, do you own your car? But my experience in 2008 was quite the opposite. The assumption was that because I was driving a nice vehicle, that perhaps I had stolen that vehicle. And rather than asking about my well-being, having been hit and hit the Jersey barrier 3 times, I spun 3 times, hit the Jersey barrier each time at 3 o'clock in the afternoon during the heat of traffic on I-95 in Washington, D.C. And the first question that the white police officer asked was not, "Are you okay?" The first question he asked was, and the first comment that I recall had to do with, "Is it his car?" White privilege means you get the benefit of not having to deal with that type of foolishness and bias. And these are the lived experiences that many people, not just Black people, but non-white people in America have had to contend with over and over and over again. When you're white, you don't have to deal with those types of issues. There may be other issues, but these are critical concerns that we need to address from the scriptures. This is why I wanted to take the time to read the text, because I wanted us to understand that fundamentally, privilege is something that the Bible, especially in the New Testament, condemns when we make distinctions by prejudging on the basis of social factors that have nothing to do with the character of an individual. Sorry for going on so long, Jeff, but I needed to really take some time and sort of dig into that.
You see, you guys see what I'm working with. I told you. You give them one question, we're going to be here all day.
Yeah.
We appreciate that so much, and those are some things that maybe we don't understand. I know that you have on your screen a limited view of our congregation, but we have 3 people of color in the room. That's it. And so these are things that most of us in this room have not had to experience. So we appreciate you sharing that.
Let me read another book. Jeff, may I mention a book very quickly
Sure.
that maybe you might want to get into? It's only 192 pages, written by Paula Rothenberg, entitled "White Privilege: Essential Readings on the Other Side of Racism." I just wanted to make mention of that.
Sure. And now all of the books and things that he's going to quote, he's going to send me an email later, and I will be able to make a resource list available to you. He didn't know that. I just decided that right now. Moving on to another question. This one also fairly deep. This came to us. It says, do you believe that race is more about genetic makeup or the culture environment you were raised in? And in terms of an example for us to understand what that means, there are lots of examples of people who are adopted, who pass, quote unquote, pass for whatever culture they are raised in. Light-skinned Hispanics can frequently pass for white people, or dark-skinned Hispanics can be passed for Black people, people of color. So what happens if suddenly later in life you find out that the culture you were raised in is not your biological ethnicity? Does race even matter at that point if you feel attached to one more than the other? Is race even a real thing? I've heard this argument, race versus ethnicity, that race was made up, but ethnicity is genetic. What is that? What do you believe, that race is more about genetics or your environment?
Well, that's a very good question. And I would say initially, it's certainly both. And the reason that it is both is because race itself is well, first of all, let me just back up and say this. It is a social construct, okay? It's a social construct. It is in fact, the progenitor of race theory and the belief in the distinction between people originated with Aristotle. the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who passed that philosophy down through the centuries up to the point where many of us believe that there are biological differences between us that separate us in terms of our humanity. And this is the reason why I say it's both, because whatever biological differences that there may be between individuals, those things have been exploited and used in an adverse way to controvert the fact that human beings are human beings. Just because a person comes from a certain geography where they may be prone to have long, stringy, thin hair versus curly, wound up hair, meaning Europe or Africa, talking about the different places where people have migrated or been birthed or migrated to, and how human anthropology factors have changed or transformed our physical appearance. Pigment, for example, and the need to block the sun's rays, living in certain places where one has a lot of exposure to heat and ultraviolet light, and then moving away from those equatorial venues to places that are more northern, beyond the Earth's equator, such that one begins to lose the pigment because it's not as necessary. So there are factors that you can attribute to science. Some might use the term, I think it's a loose way of using the term in terms of genetics, but everything has to do with genes, so we can certainly talk about that. But it's very important to realize that human beings are, first of all, made in the image and likeness of God. There's one human race, not multiple human races. And so we need to begin to formulate a strategy to begin to talk beyond just our ethnicity. For example, I'm African American. African is my ethnicity. That's where I trace my family history as a person of color to most likely West Africa. But my nationality is American. African, that's my ethnicity. American is my nationality. But guess what? Neither of those two determine my humanity. So race developed by Blumenbach, race theory was a way of trying to disintegrate or break apart the human relations factor or the connectivity that we have between people who happen to live in different places. And if you get right down to it, of one nation and of one blood, God made all human beings to dwell upon the face of the earth. So there are genetic differences, but they are insignificant. When you look at what's beneath the pigment, there are geographic differences and cultural differences that shape the way we think and feel. And if we want to say that is what race is, then I'm fine with that, so long as we don't use that as a way to create gaps of misunderstanding, fear, separation, division, and so forth, or use it as a basis for prejudicial treatment and as a way to privilege some versus others. How many of you have heard about a few cases recently in the news where white women have identified with blackness? What comes to mind, first of all, is the case of Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who certainly has white parents, but she says she's black. And then there's a case most recently, I believe it is at George Washington University, where a professor had gone for years affirming her blackness, when in fact she had to come out and say perhaps her conscience began to get the better of her in the times that we're now living in, and acknowledge that in fact she is white. And she has been terminated from her teaching position. She's lost her teaching assignments. And of course, the process perhaps might go on a little further beyond that. It's important essentially to know who we are, who our ancestors are. All of my ancestors are not Black, okay? And all of your ancestors are not white. There are very few, if any, pure-blooded whatevers on the face of the earth today. So we need to get over some of these false labels and just respect the fact. I would encourage all of us to affirm the human family and learn to work and live and play together. There are genetic differences, but they're not genetic differences that determine the quality of our humanity or the character of our ability to commune and fellowship with one another, and certainly not God.
Thank you. We only have time for a few more questions. We had 9, but I think we're going to try to get in 5. Some of them kind of cross points. So here's one. I guess we'll do 2 more because they kind of answer some how-to questions. So we'll move on from definitions and move on to what exactly we can do. So here's a question that we received. Why is it so easy to cross racial barriers with a favorite athlete or sports team more so than in our churches? Would you care to speak to that?
We're so very divided and splintered on Sunday morning. We don't worship together. We don't spend enough time together. And the whole idea of sports is to compete and to compete well. And when you're wanting to compete well, you want the best talent. And so the best talent becomes a priority for athletics because, of course, if you compete well in a capitalistic society, that means money. And no one is going to shortchange their capacity for earnings because of racial differences. We see that primarily in sports. We wish we could see more of that in corporate America. Corporate America is moving in that direction, but with sports, it doesn't involve necessarily policy to the same degree that life in corporate America might. And so you want to be entertained. Sports is entertainment. It's a game. It's fun. But it's not the regular, normal course of lived experiences that determine most of what we need to do in terms of eating, sleeping, studying, worshiping. And so there are major reasons for these differences. And I'm trying to be very quick because I wanted to get in a few more questions. But sports is an avenue that we use to entertain and relieve ourselves of our normal day-to-day activities. And thus, we are willing to compromise a bit in order to heighten our sense of entertainment because it does something for our ability to manage stress and cope with other areas of life. The church hasn't quite caught on to what it is supposed to be. And we use a lot of excuses, both Black and white, to stay in separate corners of our communities. And we need to lead by example rather than follow. And so I pray that the church would learn to not be a segregated place, but truly a unified and integrated faith community in practice rather than just in doctrinal theory.
Thank you. And I've just received a question, and so hopefully we'll have time for both of them. So here's one, and this is a personal example, so I'm going to use the word I, but it's from whoever wrote the question. It says, growing up in a predominantly white area, my first experience around someone Black was a very positive one. He was, even to this date, one of the nicest men I've ever known. My mom always told me that the only difference is the color of our skin. So the question here is, mostly with children in mind, is other than first or positive first experiences with someone of a different race or ethnicity and positive parental influences, what other things can be used to help change attitudes? What exactly can we do to help maybe not necessarily solve the problems now, but to help our children and their children move away from that?
One of the best things we can do is take the Bible seriously. And I don't say that to be coy, or to be evasive, because many of us feel that we do take the Bible seriously. But I think we need to begin to look into the mirror of the Word and see what God has to say about our ways of judging each other. Let me give you an example that comes to mind. I think about Cornelius. Cornelius was not a Christian. He was not a Jew. He was a Roman. But he believed in God. He worshiped God. He was devout. He practiced giving alms and helping others. And he practiced prayer, he and his household. And if you read in Acts, Peter was told about Cornelius and told to go to his house and minister to him so that he might receive the word of truth in the person of Jesus Christ. Okay. We need to understand that God is dealing with people in the same way that he's dealing with us. We may not see them, but God works with all humanity. He cares for all humanity. We're the ones who need to become the hands, the feet, the arms and legs to express the concern and the desire and the love of God for all humanity. Humanity has faltered in that regard because we have humanized some and dehumanized others on the basis of false theories and false histories and false nomenclatures and taxonomies. And so as children coming into classrooms, it's very clear. Children could care very little about race. I know that for a fact because that is my own experience, having grown up in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, an Air Force base where my first friends were really white. And then along the way, I began to meet different Black friends and we played together and did everything together. And yet we began to see differences as we moved along. One of the things that we can do is begin to erode and break down some of these false myths, tear down some of the barriers, get rid of some of our privilege, recognize that the conditions that make distinctions are man-made, and begin to address these distinctions in the spirit of love and in the spirit of unity that the New Testament and even the Old Testament points us to in terms of being fair to the alien and the stranger and the foreigner and inviting them in, giving one a cup of cold water, basic fundamental things that let people know, that let us know that we're living in one world, one space, or as Dr. King would say, a world neighborhood, rather than segregating ourselves into separate corners of our neighborhood.
Thank you. And this final question, this is new. I did not send this to you ahead of time because it was just handed to me. And so again, I'm going to read this as it's written. It says, what is the end goal? I hear about reparations, which sounds crazy to me, but most people I hear talking just make noise with no way to measure when we resolve the problem. How do we know when the problem is solved? So we move from what can we do to how do we know that we've done it?
The end goal of movements, let's just talk about movements, whether it be the women's suffrage movement or the civil rights movement or the movement that I would call an experiment called American democracy. When our ancestors decided that they could no longer tolerate the tyranny of Great Britain's king and came to this country. What was the end goal? I think the end goal is well articulated in our founding documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, men and women, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'm going out, so I'm going to make this very quick. I would say, Jawandalyn, if you're listening to this call, why don't you bring down your screen so we can continue talking. The goal is fairness, equity, and freedom.